check deadlines, get to know well in advance when it makes sense to start. Take advice about these things. These are terribly basic, and yet almost everything hinges upon them. And especially so if you're asked to write briefly. There is nothing as terrifying as presenting one's own biography and one's project in 500 words. 5,000 words is much easier. 50,000 words is a cinch. 500 words is sheer torture and agony, believe you me. I speak having lost a lot of blood on these things. That having been said, all self-representation for these purposes boil down to two operations: presenting oneself and presenting one's project. And whatever you're asked to do in any grant fellowship application, ultimately those two are the ranges of task into which everything else boils down. There are specific things to be said about each of those tasks, and I'll say specific things about each of them, but some things are common, indeed common to the whole process. The first is that grants and fellowships are to be written in simple prose. Now, we in the University of Chicago suffer a disease. It expresses itself in multisyllabic sentences, usually with 4 or 5 internal clauses, and often a barely sustainable relationship between subjects and predicates. When you write grant proposals, remember there's some poor sod on the other side who's going to read this stuff, and who's probably going to read it amidst another several hundred of these things, and may land up reading it at 2 o'clock in the morning. I can't tell you how easy it is to go to sleep over subordinate clauses, or indeed to glaze over when subjects and predicates become only tenuously related to one another. There is, again, a direct correlation between good writing and success. And good writing means, in fact, being able to not merely make sense of a project, but to make sense in ways that capture an eye, because there is something that is ringing about them. A bit of advice, which may come as a surprise to many of you if you have not practiced writing. And writing is, of course, a profound art. Writing is not about the eye, it's about the ear. Whenever you write anything that you expect anybody else to read and to have an impact on their consciousness, read it out loud to yourself. When you do so, you'll realize what's wrong with the prose. You'll realize if every sentence has the same structure. You'll realize if sentences are too long. You'll realize if the connection between what you say in the first clause and what you say somewhere before the period actually connects with one another. You'll realize whether you're repeating yourself over and over again. You'll realize whether you're writing redundantly, and believe you me, nothing is as quick a turn-off for readers as high levels of redundancy. You'll realize also whether, in fact, your point is getting across, whether your project is interesting. And one obligation that all of us have when we write for others is to be interesting. After all, no reader has an obligation to you to make an award. You have an obligation to make a reader decide that you are worthy of one. Use correct English. Present your application in ways that are neat, are tidy, are readable. I can't tell you how often I've sat on panels in which there have been snide comments about the dirty presentation of an application, or about spelling mistakes. And it's very easy these days to run an application through a spell check. Do it. It does make a difference. Because ultimately, the competition for monies is very stringent. And the attitude of readers is, well, if X didn't bother to put a thing through a spell check, or in fact to make my task easy, why should I give she or he a grant when there are any number of other people who are equally worthy, who've got as good projects, and who have bothered? The margins are narrow, and you reduce them precisely by taking those kinds of care. In that respect, two things to avoid. One is cutesiness, and the other is jargon. Very often we're not terribly conscious when we grow up in a discipline of what our jargon is. To us, these are technical terms, but our technical terms are often other people's jargon, other people's buzzwords, other people's cutesinesses and trendinesses. And again, there is a great tendency to run the risk when one tries to distinguish oneself by kind of cutesy prose to appear merely as superficial, and in fact to be disguising an absence of depth with a facility of style. The term facile means two things. It means to have facility and to be able to do it. It also means to be superficial. And one has to be very careful of attempting the one and merely appearing the other. Under those conditions, I suggest not only that you read your applications to yourselves, but that you read them to other people. Bore your friends. This is a time you can test your friends' friendship out, see how willing they are to listen to you. But seriously, find people who will be brutal in spotting the faciles, in spotting the superficial gesture, in spotting the cutesy phrase that doesn't work. In that respect, too, especially in avoiding jargon to try and show off knowledge, in general, try and avoid showiness. Try not to hint at knowledge that you do not have, because believe you me, somebody will know. One of the extraordinary things about sitting on panels, again, is the buzzes that go through people when an applicant says, well, nothing has been written about the ecology of the northern tundra. Believe me, somebody in the panel has a friend who has a cousin who knows somebody in some or another institution who believes that their life's work is on that topic. And there is nothing profoundly more insulting than saying nothing has been done about it. Those kinds of hints at knowledge that are suggestive often run the risk of offending people who do believe, indeed, that they control a great deal. It follows, too, the other side of that, of course, is that when one is writing this kind of prose, presenting oneself or indeed one's project, relevance is absolutely crucial. Now, it goes without saying, almost, because it always needs saying, that it makes sense to read what the specifications are on a grant application or fellowship application extremely carefully. Why? Because hidden in the kind of bureaucraties that one's eyes glaze over, because it's hard stuff to read and keep awake through, are in fact precisely the criteria on which you're going to be read. And those bureaucratic phrases often define the limits and the requirements of relevance, of salience, that are going to be used as the criteria against which everything you write is going to be evaluated. It's interesting, by the way, a lot of those are phrased in, as I say, glaze-over sorts of prose. In your application, please say something about the following, and you get a bunch of clauses, each separated by a comma. By the time you get to the fifth one, you don't even notice them anymore. What tends to happen is that between those commas, the clauses that you're asked, in fact, to address tend to be the box scores that panels are given when they're asked to evaluate your grants. So, for example, Fulbrights always say in your application, say something about your knowledge of the country in which you want to work, whether you're going to, what kinds of contacts you've had with local scholars, what sorts of relations you're going to have with the local archives, etc., etc. Now, again, those are sort of lines of stuff that you sort of begin to notice. And what one glosses that as is, well, tell us what you're going to do abroad. That's not enough, because in fact on the panelists' score charts, each one of those clauses is going to represent a box score, usually 5, 10, sometimes 15 points. And what the readers are going to be asked to do is to score your application on each one of those criteria. So, when you're given those kinds of instructions, read them carefully, rewrite them, if you like, in columns of things that you're then going to check whether you've answered. If you do the work, if you do supply the answers, your chances of getting the grants are very high. Because, in fact, just as on the writing side, there is a great deal of bureaucracies, on the reading side there is too. And readers are constantly importuned to follow those box scores very carefully indeed. And as a result, that tends to bureaucratize the evaluation process as well, in exact proportion to your application. And so you increase your chances dramatically if you simply follow those kinds of rules.